Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Book Passage. Thank you for coming out on a Thursday evening. It's so wonderful to see all of you out in an independent bookstore on a Thursday night, so thank you for being here. And I'm guessing that most of us here are love stories, and that's why we're here. And thank you for just being at this incredible event that we are able to host at Book Passage. My name is Melissa Cesaro, and I am here to introduce the director of the California Film Institute and the founder of the Mill Valley Film Festival, Mark Fishkin. And Mark founded the Mill Valley Film Festival in 1977, and it has become one of the most prestigious film festivals in the world. And how lucky are we that we get to have this great, incredible festival here every year. We're just thrilled that you're here, and thank you, Mark, for your passion and all the creative energy that you've put into this over the years. So please join me in welcoming Mark Fishkin to Book Passage.
Good evening. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here at the Book Passage. It's a great asset to the community, so thank you for continuing to do what you do. And I couldn't be more delighted to really be doing this introduction for Creativity, Inc. Like many of you in Marin County, I've had the privilege of watching Pixar grow. And I don't know if Ed recalls that I came to see him in his modest offices in San Rafael. I think it must have been 1988 or 1989 after Tintoy won the Academy Award. And I had this idea that Pixar could do our trailer naively, in my naivete, not really realizing how much work and energy goes into a short computer film, because it really hadn't been done before. And but fortunately, our friends at Pixar let us use that short, and John Lasseter put a narration at the end of it, and that was our trailer for the Mill Valley Film Festival in 1989. There are so many reasons to read this book. I have my copy here, and if I would have realized there's a real lecture in here, I would have given myself notes that I could actually read. Certainly the story of Pixar is just fascinating, and the comments that are in it and the stories that Ed tells are entertaining, and hearing about Brad Bird and Andrew Stanton and everybody, these creative geniuses who work at Pixar and what's going on behind the scenes is amazingly interesting and just a great tale. But for me, what resonated the most, because there are a lot of similarities other than size that I can relate to that resonate with me in terms of Pixar and what we do at the California Film Institute and the Mill Valley Film Festival. We're dealing with creative people a lot, all different kinds of personalities, and it's important no matter what size your business is to get the most out of your staff and let them excel, give them the opportunity to excel. And there are parts of this book, if you're a manager of anything, that would be so valuable to you or to anyone in business. But to me, it was so much more than that. I think what Ed has managed to do is to take aspects that most people would look at that are incongruent and complex and have nothing to do with each other, and put it down in a simple way. And we're talking about things like creativity and the corporate sector, and the way that it is written, it makes so much sense and it has so much meaning, not only to those in business, but to anyone in your life. For me, this book really has resonated and will help me not only be a better manager, but I really do believe this, but a better person. And I want to thank you, Ed, for being so creative in your prose in putting this book together. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Jim Morris, who's the executive vice president of Pixar and been an institution in Marin in the filmmaking business. And of course, the president of Pixar, Disney Animation, at Catmull.
Hi, everybody. I'm here to be the adjutant tonight and talk a little bit about some of the things we're going to talk about, but also asking some questions and kind of steer things a little bit before we get to your Q&A a little bit later. And I think one thing to kind of start out on, there's a long story that sort of led up to the point where Ed was at Pixar and running Pixar as it split off from Lucasfilm. But I think it's kind of interesting for everybody to know where this all started with you, because you were passionate about animation as a kid, and that was kind of the beginning of the path, it seems like.
Yeah, for me, I grew up in the 1950s, and it wasn't until years later that I realized that adults didn't talk about it, was that this was just after this massive war and after this Great Depression. So here was this time in the 50s, which was pretty remarkable, protective environment. And for me, the two iconic figures were Walt Disney and Albert Einstein. And I grew up wanting to be an animator. And I was good at drawing, spent a lot of time drawing. When I got out of high school, I actually couldn't find any school that taught how to do this. There wasn't a school. There wasn't no CalArts to do this. So I switched over into physics. And after college, I went to graduate school. And in graduate school, or starting there, I realized that the frontier in physics was a long ways away. But in this area of computer science, it was like being at the front of the ribbon of an Easter egg hunt. They just cut the ribbon. And so
No.
What it meant for me, this University of Utah, was that here was a place to marry the technology and the art. And at that time, the graphics were very crude. They were black and white and all made out of polygons. And I believe by the time I graduated that it would probably take about 10 years to make an animated feature film. So that became my goal. That was wrong. It was 20. But I went off to New York, where I was in a great environment, and I had this theory about how to manage a group. Because the problem was that while I was in charge of a group out there, I didn't actually want to manage at all. I wanted to do the research. And so the theory was, if I hired people who are smarter than I am, then they'll be self-motivated enough to take care of things, and I don't have to be the manager. Now, after 5 years, and there really was a remarkable group of people, but George Lucas wanted to bring technology into the film industry, and so he hired me to come out from Lucasfilm. So this is in 1979. And George was willing to do what nobody else in that industry would do. We were also in this interesting position where we're an hour and a quarter away from Silicon Valley, and we're a little bit longer in terms of the Kennedy Airport and airplane ride down to Hollywood. So we're separated, remote from both, but at the same time close enough that we can interact on both sides. At that time, I had to revise how I thought about things, but we brought in again some more remarkable people, and this is about 5 or 6 years, and then Steve Jobs brought the group out in 1986, and we formed Pixar, initially here in Marin, and then a little I went from place to place, I was learning by watching what was happening at other companies, as well as realizing that a lot of my theories about managing were wrong. Some were right. You've heard of the 90-10 rule or 80-20 and so forth. My view was about 70% of the decisions were right, 30% were wrong. Now, honestly, it's just a number that's I'll pull out of the air, but I think that 90-10, for instance, actually is delusional. That I'm actually wrong a lot, and I don't always know at the time which it is. But when we started Pixar, the fact is all we could do was sell hardware, and there are people here who were part of the early days of Pixar. And at that time when we were starting, I knew nothing about business whatsoever. The truth is, Steve Jobs knew nothing about high-end hardware business. He had this intuition from selling Apple computers, but none of that intuition applied to the development and selling of high-end hardware. So none of us knew what we were doing. And the fact is, we failed as a business. And Steve tried a couple times to sell us, but then he wouldn't do it. So we went through a lot of difficult times together and failed together, but somehow by failing together, we actually bonded and knew that we had each other's backs until we finally had the opportunity to enter into a relationship with business. And as a result of that relationship, we were able to make Toy Story, which came out 4 years later. So now, 20 years later, everybody knew this had been the goal of this group for all these years. I got a lot of calls afterwards, and it felt great. It felt really good, too, because when the reviews came out for Toy Story, most reviews had at most one line saying that it was a computer-graphic movie. The rest of it was about the film itself. And one of the nice things is the technical group felt great about this. That they all believed it was about the story. But after going through this for this brief period of time, and we were now a public company, and we were off and running and a lot of visibility, I personally felt lost because I just achieved my goal. And my goal hadn't been to run a company; it had been to get the film out. And it took about a year to resolve that. And I went through a lot in there trying to think it through. And the one thing I realized was that in watching Disney animation at the time and in watching Silicon Valley companies, that there was this phenomenon that creative people get together. They do something very remarkable. They have an effect, and then most of them fall apart. And at the end of the year, I came to believe that the new goal was to figure out what was going on in those companies and make creative groups fall apart. And that if we could think about that and address that and apply it to Pixar, then that would be a worthy challenge.
There's a couple little pieces Ed left out about the history. In the process of him trying to surround himself with people smarter than himself, he actually invented a number of the key building blocks of computer graphics that are still kind of the foundation today. Also, you mentioned the machinery part of the Pixar business family. There was a machine called a Pixar as well, which was an image calculating, image rendering device that business didn't work out or get big enough. But I think the interesting thing is after you got to the point where you'd accomplished your goal, you sort of did switch into the leadership and management role, and that's really what the crux of the book is about. And I think the thing to me that you started at that point and became kind of the cornerstone of it is at the very moment when you were successful and the company was successful, you were sort of turning your view to introspection and trying to figure out what really worked, what were the underlying principles, what didn't work, what were the things that could cause a problem down the road. And I think that's kind of the core of the book in many ways, is that sort
thing I noticed at the time was that there was no introspection within that group. They were successful, therefore what they were doing was correct. And in working with a lot of the companies down in Silicon Valley, and they were successful, and I knew a lot of these people, it's just there really wasn't any introspection about what was going on. And then when they fell apart, the groups would disband. So whatever knowledge they had was actually rearranged into different groups. We were fortunate in that we had a person supporting it, Steve Jobs, who was keeping the group together at great personal cost. So that helped us as a group bond, but also allowed us to be able to think about what was working and what wasn't working. And the idea of introspection is a very important one to me. If you were to ask a group of people what you can do to be more creative, then usually only a few hands would come up with ideas. But if you were to ask a group, what can you do to actually block creativity? Then everybody's got ideas. They've all experienced that. And that usually people, it's like facing in the wrong direction. Because they want to figure out what they should do or get to the answer. And the deeper and more interesting thing are those systemic and cultural forces that block creativity. And we all see them. And so the question is, what are they? And in thinking about it, I just realized that if these smart people were missing it, then basically it's hidden from view. And the implication is that whatever those things that are going off the rail are happening then, they're happening now, today, at Pixar, and that Jim and I, who deal with them, can't see a lot of it. And introspection means realizing that there's stuff that we can't see, either at a personal level or at a company level. And that it's critical to spend some time thinking about what, or at least looking for stuff you can't see. Knowing that we can never see everything. But if you don't ask the question, then you will miss it for sure.
So the preponderance of companies, whether they're in the entertainment business or any sort of organization, tends to make great effort to avoid failure, or the appearance of failure. People don't want to look like they failed, and it's a dark mark on you if your company has a failure. Can you talk about your philosophy of failure?
Well, I know right now there are a lot of books written about the importance of failure for learning. So at an intellectual level, we all get that. We've all had failures in our lives. We've learned from it. And so we say, well, we should allow failure. We should make it happen. So that's the intellectual level. But there's an emotional level about failure. This is the one that we learned in school, in grade school. And if you fail the class, it's because you screwed up or you didn't work hard enough. Right? And that's deeply seated into it. You were graded on that. And so one of the grades was F for fail. So that's built into us. But now as adults, we can say, okay, well, there are these two things. They get conflated. But it's even worse than that. Because we are daily inundated with the news. And the news is about people writing about people in the government or in businesses who are failing or screwing up. And anytime somebody makes a mistake, it is portrayed in a very bad way. So these negative views of failure are all around us, and they are intertwined with this intellectual one. And if we don't understand that, then our personal goal is to avoid the failure. Like the academic thing of how failure is part of learning actually turns into an inward one where we say, well, failure is a necessary evil. My belief is that it's not a necessary evil. That in fact it's a necessary consequence of doing something new. And one has to really get that and connect the dots. So it isn't just that failure is important, but in some things you actually want the failure. It's a indication that you are learning and that you're trying something different. It's also complicated because there is an element of zero errors and zero failure, which is very meaningful. And there are a few areas like that. So if you think of the aircraft industry, then zero failures is a clear concept, and it's a meaningful one, and it's a desirable one. If we're going through medical procedures, and while there are a lot of unknowns about the body and so forth, we actually want them operating on the right side of the body and on the right organ. So, so if you ever, you go to a standard place like that, they have protocols, and the protocols that keep asking you for your name or your birth date, they're all part of error prevention. So this notion of zero errors is a clear one, and we understand it. But there are a lot of areas where zero errors is either meaningless or harmful. So if you try to go for zero errors in our business, then you actually are damaging yourself. It is completely the wrong place to go. And this is a pretty hard concept, because to take the other side of it, it's like, okay, suppose a person's making hundreds of errors. They probably shouldn't be in the job. All right, so you've got two clear things, like, somebody makes a lot of mistakes, they don't belong here. Zero is a bad place to be. All right, but it's a clear concept. So where should you be? Well, this is really the fuzzy area. This is the hard problem. Most people believe the hard problem. They want the simplicity of getting rid of failure and going for the zero. And where we want to be is in that mess in the middle. That's where we should be. And by definition, then, that means we have to accept that failures are there, and we don't punish the people for those failures. We reward them.
So the notion, Andrew Stanton, the director we work with, says, be wrong as quick as you can, so you can hopefully be right fairly soon after that. And he has been wrong on many occasions. I've been at his side, as that's been happening many times. Be good if you talk about the failures that have happened to Pixar, because if you're just a moviegoer, it looks like there's this incredible slate of successes, and every film that's come out has been the biggest grossing film of the weekend on the weekend that's come out. But that doesn't tell the story of how those films got there, or what the company or ad or the people went through to have that happen, and all of the failures that led up to those successes.
So we've had failures at every stage. So, and they all have a different story. Like there isn't any pattern there that you can say, okay, I'm going to fix this. We do learn things from it. We learn from these failures, but the pattern changes every time because the personalities and the issues are different. The one thing that's clear is that when we start our movies, and this is hard to understand for some people, is that all of our movies at the beginning suck. And some people think that we're saying that because we're being modest or self-effacing. And that actually isn't what we mean. What we mean is they suck. They really don't work at all. And so we will go along, and one of the implications of that is you can't judge the team by the quality of what they produce. This is a hard concept, because the normal thing is, like, you want to figure out if the team is working. Say, well, what are they doing? Well, there's a period of time which they're working on doesn't work. So they actually need some protection during that period of time. And they can't be protected forever. And you can't have the protection when there'll be too little. So you're actually going through this thing where the only thing you've got to judge is the spirit of the team. And if that team is working really well together, they'll fix the problem. And if they're not working, it doesn't matter if it's a good idea. They'll screw it up. Right? And that happens all over the place, right? So, but some people don't understand that, because they want to have this deliverable. And the thing that where I first noticed this was actually at Disney, because they had this term, you have to feed the beast. So the beast is the production crew that made the film. So it's a creative group of people. They have a lot of work material for it to work on, it can be a financial disaster for the company. So frequently, your most organized people are in charge of the beast. So what happened at Disney in the 90s after The Lion King was they put these organized people over the front end. But they brought the same values of meeting schedules and budgets and so forth to the creative front end. And these guys are way too loosey-goosey for comfort. So they organized it. And they organized it out of creativity. What ended up happening. And we can see this from the side. I mean, and again, because they weren't introspective, they weren't observing what was happening. So in working with Pixar, I was saying, okay, we have to figure out how to protect them early on. And until we had times when even with that protection, at some point, it might fall apart. And so they were left with this tricky problem, which we have to this day, to figure out, okay, when is it working and when is it not working? Like, again, we're back in this messy middle again. So we should go through a couple of these things where what it means to go through the change in the mess at the beginning. And actually, you're in a bit of a position to talk about Wall-E and the changes that it went through.
Well, the first film I produced at Pixar was a film called Wall-E that Anderson directed, and I come from the visual effects business, and we weren't really dealing with the key creative aspects of the story and script. We were sort of executing pieces of the film under the leadership of a director who were kind of doing work for hire. The difference of making an animated motion picture is you're doing everything from soup to nuts. So you're coming up with the idea and then working the story. When Ed says that the movies suck at the beginning, we make a number of iterations of each movie, usually 6 to 8. And we make story reels, which are a rough gesture of the whole movie, beginning to end, with dialogue, voices, etc. And those are the things you look at and try to figure out how bad it is and what you need to fix and so forth. So how many of you have seen Wall-E? Okay, so imagine our original plan was to have no English language whatsoever. The whole script with the humans was written in a language that we kind of stole from IKEA catalogs. The humans in this film had evolved in space. They've been there for so long that they sort of devolved into gelatinous matter. And the robots had been enslaved and modified with scrapers, and their job was to scrape the lint off of these gelatinous blobs. That was our second act. And we look back on it now, and it's hard to explain that we were not actually smoking crack, and it kind of seemed like a fine idea. Good, we had a rave in the middle of it. We had Peter Gabriel ready to write a song. It was all going to be smoking. So meanwhile, as we're on our drug trip there is another group that kind of helps oversee the creative shaping of the projects and helps try to guide these along. And it's sort of the checks and balance that doesn't let you make mistakes forever. And that's the brain trust. You may have heard about it, and if you've looked at the book, you've seen it. But maybe that's a good thing to talk about, like what the role of that group was to help get things back on track.
So the brain trust we found completely by accident. And our luck was the first 5 creative people working on Toy Story were phenomenal geniuses. They were funny. They were focused. They were intense. When they argued, it was the argument about what was in the story, and it was never personal. And they viewed those intense discussions as invigorating. And it was a remarkable group to watch. We didn't call it the brain trust to begin with, but just the guys who were making film. And then they went on and made Bugs Life. And then we were making Toy Story 2, which was about 9 months from completion, collapsed into a smoking heap of rubble on the floor. And we had to restart it. So this group basically is the one that came in and redid it. And around this time, I think Andrew was the one who started to call it the brain trust. And it works so remarkably well that we actually tried it in different very smart, but they're peers with each other. And the reason we set it up so they have no authority was that by not having any authority, then the director was now, or could approach this without the posture of being defensive. And it enabled the director to listen. So in observing this and thinking, okay, well, this is part of what makes it work, we then started paying attention to, okay, what are the differences about the dynamics of a group of smart people? Because you could, at one level, you could say, a brain trust is just a group of smart people. But this is more than that. When they were peers, they had a vested interest in each other's success. That was very important. The other one was that we had to recognize that there were human emotional elements which applied to any group. So, if you imagine like you're in a group like that, well, if you spoke, and I have to say, the group grew over time, we added people to it, so this is where the dynamics began to change as we added people. So, if you come into the group, you don't want to say something that makes you look stupid. Right? So there's a natural reticence to be candid and honest. And you can understand that. I mean, suppose you were giving notes to Steven Spielberg when he was showing you Lincoln. And would you raise your hand and say, excuse me, Mr. Spielberg, but I think you have two endings on your phone here. You probably should leave one. All right. You probably wouldn't do that. All right. And that's the way people are when they come into a group where there are these strong, powerful people. You know, there's the thing. But the other is you also don't want to embarrass somebody. There are also sometimes people who actually want to show how clever they are. So you've got all these dynamics going on in the group. And the way we structured it is that Jim and I, as manager of the company, feel it's our obligation to look at the dynamics. They're looking at the problem. We're looking at how the group works together. And so what we've got this group or we have this group. Sometimes it doesn't work. And then we have to regroup, we get together and say, okay, we have to change the group up and redo this or rethink this. So that happens once in a while. Usually it works very well because of the nature of the group. And every once in a while, magic happens. And you don't know when it's going to happen, but all of a sudden these things propel forward. It's like everybody's focused on a problem, and this phenomenal thing happens. And it's basically what we try to do is to enable the environment for that to happen. And there's one other element I should say too, is while this group over the years has evolved and changed and so forth, I would say that the people in this group love each other. I mean, there's a really strong feeling, even when things get tough. And it's part of what makes the group work so well.
The group elevates the films and tries to work with the director to guide them to do it. We had a film last year that, despite several years of effort, was not getting elevated or didn't appear to be getting elevated quickly enough, and we had to postpone its release and kind of do a restart on it. And it was a very painful process. And it was a process where Ed and I realized we were making a fundamental mistake about the brain trust, which is it's not their job to say it's gone too far. It was our job to say it's gone too far, because they have to maintain the trust in the room with one another that they're never actually making judgments about the other's viability. So we have to do that. But the thing I wanted to get at that also was sort of surfaced with some clarity in this is the importance of the rest of the organization's opinion, the other employees, what they're seeing, and whether we're hearing what they're seeing. And I think that's something, we talk about the brain trust and the creative leadership and so forth, but a lot of the success of Pixar has been the bubbling up of the individual employees who are seeing something that we're not seeing or calling attention to something. And we found that there were some blocks in that. I don't know if you want to speak about that sort of stuff happening.
Yeah, and it's one of the most interesting things because it's coming back to one of the premises is that there are things that are hidden from us. And so we're trying to uncover this stuff, and the fact is there's the human dynamic which is getting in the way. The managers want to make sure things run smoothly. They sometimes give signals to people inadvertently or accidentally. important to think about these different levels of things that are hidden. At one level, at the easiest level, because we're the managers, we actually rarely see poor behavior directly. Now, if we weren't aware of that, and I've met a lot of managers who actually aren't aware of that phenomenon. So they think that, oh, I'm still one of the guys, right? Well, it's not true, right? Now, there are people that you have friends, long-term friendships, and they will tell you, because you value those people there. But for new people coming in, and you're going to give this warm speech and talk about how important standards and so forth, right? They actually take their clues from their manager about whether or not things are safe or dangerous. So we have to be aware of that. But there are levels of things that get deeper and deeper in terms of what's hard to see. And I don't want to go into that now because it's what I talk about in the book, but I think it's there, and that's what come back to introspection, is that introspection is fundamentally a different kind of thing than looking outward. Whether it's personal or whether it's a company. It's a different kind of activity. Most of the time we spend looking outwards. It's our natural activities, our brain's kind of wired up that way. But every once in a while we need to do that different kind of thing. And then spend some time integrating the inward view with the outward view. And these are hard, difficult things to do, but they're the kind of things we should be doing. So we've got that whole set of issues. We've got people who want things to run smoothly. And then we're in an environment where things are changing. And actually I want to end with a couple things around that we want to end here with. One of my favorite stories has to do with the change on up. Actually, I should give a counter example. This is on Toy Story 3. So we made 14 films, and we were making Toy Story 3, and unlike any of the other films, Toy Story 3 at the very first pitch found an emotional chord at the end of the film which made us choke up the very first pitch. But there was the goal. Now, the film was very hard to make still, but we knew what that was. So everything about that film was about earning that emotion at the end of the film. So we're getting near the end of the film, and Steve called me and asked how things are going. And I said, well, it's really pretty weird, but we don't seem to have a major problem with this film. And he said, well, you know, that's when you're in the most dangerous position. You better watch out. So I said, oh, I'm not too worried, because in our next couple films, we're screwed. But the other extreme example I want to give of one of my films that one of my favorites is Up. Okay, so I just want to give you a flavor of how this works. So the first version of Up took place on a castle. And the castle was floating in the sky. And the people in the castle were at war with the people on the ground. And there was a king who had two sons, and the sons hated each other. And through some sort of accident, the two sons ended up on the ground in enemy territory, wandering around. And in their wanderings, they came across a large bird. That version didn't work. And the only thing left was the bird and the word up. that's the range in the positive end, and the other is that sometimes we do a restart, and they're painful and they're hard, but we end up in a good place. So we have our failures.
So I guess we can do a Q&A now. And we'll start with you, sir.
I'm wondering if the issues and challenges of managing a Pixar changed when it became 100% owned by Disney.
Well, that's actually a cool event that happened. It was 8 years ago, and we knew at the time we were going to negotiations. We knew that Steve had a serious illness, and we didn't know how long it was going to last. And I should also say, and I write about it in the book, on the epilogue, is that Steve changed dramatically in the last 15, 20 years. And there's the mythology about Steve and the way he behaved in his early years, and then there's the mythology of Apple turning around. But in these last 15 to 20 years, everybody stayed with Steve, so nobody talked about him because they weren't going to talk about analyze him while he's still alive. But he became a very empathetic person. The way he worked with people changed. He became a great partner and a listener, and he became a great partner for the rest of the very different view. But in any case, when Michael Eisner left and Bob Iger came in, Bob Iger called Steve and they struck up a long and lasting friendship. It was a very good, it was a great friendship. And we set out to protect Pixar, so we actually put together a list of 47 things, 57 things with Pixar that couldn't change for 5 years. And it's now been 8 years, and that list is still there. But to be honest, there are people who are upset with that original list because they thought, why should Pixar be exceptional? And we actually had some silly things on the list. We didn't know what was important and what wasn't important. But to this day, we're not on a payroll system. We have a different health program, different vacation schedule. It's like we're like an island, but we've been careful to have bridges to them. It's been a model that's worked very well. But we work hard to keep the culture unique, and that has worked well. And people there feel like Pixar is theirs. So they're proud to be part of Disney, and they love the fact that our characters end up in the parks, and Disney marketing has done a great job for us. So those things have worked well. And this notion of God on bridges is I think is a model where it would work. But it has actually worked remarkably well.
We had a CFO at the time of the acquisition in Dollywood Common, and he was really the person who was spending most of the time with John and that had traveled back and forth to LA because they're done their work seeing this determination. And I mention it because he is a very wise guy in a lot of ways, and he helped facilitate building a lot of relationships with key people at Disney, primarily executives. There is kind of a midriff of mediocrity at Disney, but there's actually a very good executive team of people who get it and are smart. And I think we've spent a lot of time building and cultivating those relationships, which is not difficult to do because, when you're in sync with them, it works well. They're enlightened enough to know how the business works. They get it that they don't know how the stuff works, and they're happy to have us do it. But we keep them informed enough that there's a high level of trust, and it kind of stayed out of our business.
The other thing I should note is we had this almost unbelievable opportunity. We had strong views about the underlying philosophy about how we thought about change and error and mistakes and how we get beyond error and deluding ourselves. But nevertheless, because there are always things out of our sight, we could be doing things and not even properly crediting people we didn't really understand. Well, now all of a sudden, we were in charge of another studio that was failed, Disney Animation. And they were demoralized. They hadn't made a good film in a long time. And so we went into this, and our view was we were going to try to turn them around. But we kept this very strict line, which is that neither studio could do any production work for each other whatsoever. It's still true to this day. And so we applied the principles to the group. Now, when we explain them, they sound good. Like, support each other and be honest and have a brain trust and all those things. making them work took a lot of time, because while the ideas are good, you actually have to earn the trust of somebody else, and earned trust takes time. Now, we made 6 films since we've been there, and every one of them has been critically acclaimed. I say that in a Rotten Tomato score. So. But when we got to Tangled, we had by that time earned the trust of the marketing, which again took a while. And Tangled became the biggest film since Lion King, so it's like this huge success. And then there was Wreck-It Ralph, which was another big success for them. And then this last year, Frozen. And Frozen 2 weeks ago became the highest grossing animated film of all time. Bypassing Toy Story 3. But here's the thing to note about it. It's largely the same people who were there when they were there. All we were doing was removing the barriers and making it work. Okay?
Yes, I'd like to understand a little bit more about how you focus on the dynamic of brain trust with thinking children, which is part of it. So I presume this group is large enough to where you have some distribution of egos in there, because some might be more reticent to speak of, others might be sort of incredibly on, but yet when you're working well in this group, obviously there's confidence. So how is it that you focus on managing that dynamic? What is this like?
Well, when you're in the room, you can see those kinds of behaviors when they happen. So there are a few tricks that we've learned, and one of them that John is very good at is because John has made so many successful movies and is such a strong personal force, that John will start off by giving them accolades for the work, because they've just been busting themselves to get this done in time. So they're exhausted, and they need that attaboy at the beginning of this thing. And then he doesn't say anything for a while. And it's intentional. It's to not put out there something where somebody's feeling like, well, okay, am I going counter to what John said? So by the time he enters into discussions, like people have now forgotten that, and you're now in a discussion. And so he consciously tries to step back until we get to the right time. So that's one of the tools. But the other would say sometimes it actually doesn't work, and Jim and I have to look at that. There are a couple other people there that are sensitive to the dynamics, so they'll march in our office afterwards and say, "Oh, that didn't work." And so one of them in particular, he's very. I feel all of it. They all feel like they own the culture. So while we're saying it's our job to look at it, like when there's a problem, they believe it's their job to fix it. So that ownership is a critical element to make this work. Now, the other element here is all directors get lost in their film. And it's a hard thing to understand, but they lose objectivity. And so what you have are these peers out there to help them see the truth. But they all do have different egos, and it's hard sometimes to pull them out of it. So what you want sometimes is an external force. And the truth is we've only had 2 or 3 external forces that have worked well in the past, that break through even the issues that we have there. In the early days of Pixar, it was Tom Schumacher, who was the head of the studio, but then he moved out and he went over to direct Broadway productions. Another force we have is we have usually one audience screen, somewhat late in the game. But when you actually put the film, which is usually like 2/3 complete, or 2/3 animated, the whole film is there, but a third of it goes into line drawings and scratch voices and temporary. But it's enough so the audience gets the feeling in. But when you're sitting in the room next to an audience member, it actually puts your head in a different place, like it whacks you up, and you pay attention in a different way. So that's one of our forces. The other force actually was Steve. And Steve Steve never came to a brain trust meeting. And this was intentional because he was such a strong personality with all of the dynamics. And he understood that and respected that. But he would see it as a board member. So we would show it to him, but if we were in a bad place, like we were stuck, then I would tell him ahead of time, I said, we've got a tough one here. But I would never tell him what the problem is, or I would never tell him what to think. And I love this speech anyway. But so he would go, and knowing there's a problem. And then we'd have the meeting, and we'd have the director, and would come in. And Steve was amazing in the way he did this. He would say, well, the first thing to know is, I'm not a filmmaker, so you can ignore everything I say. And then he would proceed with incredible acuteness. He was very articulate. He would dissect the movie and the problem. And when he said it, he was so clear. And he said it in a kind way. And I really mean this. It was in a kind way. But it was so clear that it was like a gut punch for the director. Like it just knocked him back. Here was the curious thing about it, though, is there wasn't any observation that Steve ever made that hadn't already been made by one of the other directors. Right? So from their point of view, it's like, okay, what am I chopped meat? I already said this. But the fact is, sometimes personalities do, like you sort of discount something and you don't listen. So we want the external force. And the thing is, what happens in some places, the external force can be so dominant it takes over. And that's not what I mean by external force. It's like that pain once in a while that can be objective. And it's in frequency that helps make it objective, as well as the power behind it. So those are just part of the things there. And as I say, sometimes it doesn't work well. But usually it works very well.
One of the things that in the day-to-day of it that happens, we have a brain trust session usually in conjunction with the screening. So we put each of these films up somewhere between a half a dozen each time, something like that. And if we find that it's difficult for us to reshape the dynamic of how that movie's going in progress, but there's always some sort of follow-up meeting 3 days later, a week later. It's varied in terms of different inclinations. We have a lot of ability to kind of course correct and go and talk to various participants who are going to be in this follow-up. You guys were pretty rough on this and this, but it seemed like you missed this, and you may want to think about bringing this person in to do that. So we can kind of, I guess I'd say, guide with gentle hands behind the scenes so that make some of those course corrections to get things back on track. Because you don't really want to mess up the jam session that's going on in the room, but it doesn't always end where it should.
I have a question on failure. Have you ever gotten to a place with a film that you just say, you know what, we need to walk away from this, it's not going to work? Or do you always take precedence if you use this for
Only once in Pixar's history have we abandoned a piece of film. And what we would have restarted it, which is the norm. Because when you do a restart, you actually have learned a lot, even though we went through a lot of pain. And like Ratatouille is an example of that. We did a restart. Toy Story 2 is an example. And we could say the new person came in and elevated to a different place. But actually, Jimmy gave the analogy. It's sort of like baseball, where you've got the starting pitcher, and then at some point somebody needs to finish it off. In baseball, that's the norm and it's accepted. But in this world, it's embarrassing not to finish it off. But you actually have to recognize that that person started actually mined a lot out of it and learned a lot from it. So it's embarrassing that you can't discount their contribution to it. But nevertheless, with Brad Bird came into Ratatouille, there was a logjam in there. And because there was a chef, this old chef, and he was near the end of his career. And you got this rat who wants to cook. And so is it a chef story, is it a rat story? And it's going back and forth. It's actually stuck in this loop. And they couldn't solve the problem with it. Redemption for this guy or aspirational. So so being stuck and all of our other things didn't work, so Brad Bird took it over. And so almost immediately, Brad killed the chef. So in the movie, he's a figure of imagination. Right? So he's dead, and now all of a sudden, the rat has got this figment of imagination which allows him to talk when needed to somebody. Remember, the rat can't talk to the human. Right? So they don't understand English. So he needs some way of expressing himself, and now all of a sudden we end up with this amazing thing.
Which was a tiny little chiropractic adjustment in some ways. It went from being a European art film about a rat who wanted to cook to kind of being Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. It sort of wholly changed what the movie was about, fundamentally, even though it had 95% of the same components.
Yeah, so you work hard to design this management system response to creativity. I'm wondering, do you think that the system is, can maintain itself and in turn eventually create another head and another job? Because ultimately it's going to need to with it.
Well, this is the question we go through now. I mean, in fact, I'm not 69 years old. And while I'm in excellent health and work out and so forth, and I have to say, okay, what is the right transition? And I know at the early days of Disney, Disney was so self-identified with this company that he actually couldn't conceive of what it was to be without it. So he didn't set anything up after he left. Steve was very aware of that, and so he talked about it at Apple. He said, I don't want to be like Walt. And while I personally feel invested, and we knew this all the time with Pixar, but his soul was deeply embedded in Apple, and that was always clear. But he worked hard to make sure that there was value that was passed on. And what makes this tricky is that the things we went through to build Pixar, we can't do again. And the people that are coming on can't experience what we did, and we can't expect them to. And the thing it turns into is something that we can't foresee. So what we do as leaders is say, okay, who are these people? How do we have them come up and own our current problems? So we always have problems, and we're always going to have them. But it isn't just like, okay, we keep solving them until, one of us feels over or retires or whatever like that, and then what happens? Now, you don't want to do that. We say, okay, the current set of problems we've got, we fix them. And they own the solution.
We have, on the key creative side, there's John and Andrew Stanton, there's the membership Steve Doctor, and they're the kind of fast to work group. And the thing that's become clear to us and clear to them over time is we can't replace them. The question is, what's the new version of them that will take the company and the art of cinema, in fact, to a new and different place? We don't want to remake what they've done, and that's a tricky thing because it's kind of trying to figure out what you don't know. So there's people that we kind of put bets on and go like, I think this person may have something that's going to take us someplace, and about 50% of the time it works on some level, I think.
Yeah, we wish the rate were higher, but that's part of what it means to take a gamble, right? Sometimes it doesn't work out. And we're also very aware that I think even in all of motion picture history, I think there is anybody like John in terms of raising up other directors. And a lot of directors have come up and they get full acknowledgement. Walt Disney didn't do that. All right? The public said, well, Walt made all these films. The directors weren't, which developed the same way.
Most directors are not known for their generosity of spirit towards other directors or towards grooming and so forth. Even the best directors, you can appreciate that. There's a lot of sort of self-absorption probably necessary to be effective as a director and a tough person at times. And John seems to be able to do that, but also kind of he's groomed 25 directors, something like that across the 3 studios that have achieved some level of success that he takes great pride in their success. So even if you go and look at examples like Irving Thalberg and people like that historically, there's nobody quite that's done the same sort of mix of things. And that's hard to replace, obviously.
Yeah, it's hard to put them, but we want that value to go on, because the value is, I want somebody else to look good. And so you want that group of people to feel like, okay, I'm better off if the other people look good. As long as we understand that, I think we're in a position for transitioning to something new, but it won't be the same thing as we had before, because by definition it can't.
First of all, I was going to say, when you said all the directors get lost in their films, I had to really smile because I'm a producer and I've worked with a number of directors, and it's not always easy to kind of give them the feedback that may or may not improve. I have two questions in regards to that. You said Tom Schumacher and both Steve were there, that really tough external force you needed to kind of have checks and balances, and number one, do you have somebody else to take their place in this capacity? And number two, when Steve Jobs was on an interview with Charlie Rose some years ago, he was talking about the importance of the hero's journey and how he was a stickler for it, and that he actually, I guess at some point, was exposing or encouraging the creative people within Pixar to learn the hero's journey. So do they still follow that path of learning the hero's journey, and is there an external force that keeps things in checks and balances?
Well, those are two separate questions.
Yeah.
First of all, as the directors get more success, then and you work with them, right? And it does get tougher. So it takes a lot of soul searching on their own part when they get stuck to actually provide that for each other, and that's what we've tried to set up. But the other question is the hero's journey. Now, of course, we're all aware of that, but actually, that's not the way we think about our film. Is that the way we think about our film is that we're trying to find real human emotions that people can relate to. But what's ironical about it, from our point of view, is Steve went through the hero's journey.
Yeah.
So, he created this kingdom. He didn't behave well at that time. He was kicked out. He formed these two companies. He learned a lot. He was transformed as a result of going through those, and then returned to Apple as a hero. So when we say hero's journey, oh, that was Steve's life. But to be honest, it's not the terminology we've got with each film. It is that it's how do we get emotions? Like we're got whatever like lamps or whatever. But, how do you have something that people connect to and get something from?
I mean, you can make if you're doing a term paper, you probably make a philosophical argument that there's a little hero's journey in each of the films, but they're not fundamental to that. I mean, they tend to kind of come from an autobiographical place for each of the filmmakers, and something that was emotive to them that moved them into, I mean, in a way, they're more like road wedding pictures when you get down to it, that the primary film.
In 90 minutes, there's only so much you can do. So, again, we try to make that 90 minutes work tonight.
But we have a hero's journey film in development.
Well, I can pinpoint the hero's journey in every single one of your films. They're just
But you
there.
can say that about any film that has a character arc where the character changes.
Absolutely.
I mean,
Right.
you know.
So, so I'm saying is, well, we're aware of it. The way they're thinking of it isn't terminally. They're saying, okay, the character needs to change, and the thing that we're very aware of is we want the main character to be the one to change. And one of the things that happens in some movie is the main character frequently isn't interesting. It's like the side characters that are interesting. And that was certainly true with some of the Disney films, right? That sometimes the main characters were kind of bland, and so they would put these interesting supporting characters around them. So the terminology is how do we have the arc of the character change, and the other things you worry about are other things like what you don't want to do is to make your film cut and paste. So everybody knows the craft of making filmmaking, and a lot of people think that if they apply the craft, they make film. In fact, that's the way a lot of films are. They're the application of the craft, but in fact, the film is a wholly derivative from pieces of the film. So we asked everybody to go out on a research trip. We want bring things from outside that most people wouldn't know about. And again, Ratatouille is a good example of that. You send people off to 3-star restaurants in France. Some research trips are tougher than others. But they would go in the kitchen. Actually, one of we went to the French Laundry, and we got the full 5-course meal there. And it turns out, like my wife, she just ate like 5 hours. It was over the top. Even though the food was spectacular, but 27 courses, it was a good lunch. But the thing is, you're in the kitchen and learning things about it. There are things that take place in those kitchens that they're not putting inside the food channel, right? So that's a show they're putting on. So they put these in the movie, and most people wouldn't know whether some of those things are true or not, because they haven't been in those kitchens. But when they're in there, you sense that they're true. And it's that subconscious sense that there was something real that was in there that actually touches us and makes it feel.
And the other piece of that is, the old notion of writing a character's complete story before you start on a screenplay or a novel or whatever. So you know everything about that character. You've written their whole biography. Even if you don't refer to any of that in writing the character in the book, you know them so well and exactly what they were doing in a situation. And that sort of truth comes through, the research sort of truth comes through that way as well. It's sort of built on something that's just, you sense somehow is right. Spend a lot of time and money doing that.
Can we do one more question, because we want to make sure we have time to
Okay.
sign the book, everyone?
Okay, I'm just curious, clearly you have a very rigorous process and your style I would work to. This is your relationship with your audience, and obviously your track record is tremendous. Do you worry and concern yourself ever with, how do you make sure you don't lose passion? Is it just the fact that what you do in the show universes that work now or work 20 years from now or work 50 years from now? Is that something you're
Well, at some level, as a group, that group of filmmakers, and it isn't just the brain trust, we refer a lot to them, but one of the things we've learned is that we incorporate multiple writers into the process, so we feel part of the brain trust, and are treated that way. And we've gotten better at including them, but we have a lot of people there who love film as a way of communicating. And we trust their overall sense, because it's not market driven. As a company, we span a range of films. So some of our films are clearly likely to be successes, like we announced we're going to do Incredibles 2, and the company wants to do it, and the public wants it. Brad wants it, and he'll do a fantastic job. And it will be hard to make, but it will likely be very successful. And we have some of the films that are like that. And then we've got some other films at the other range, like A Rat That Wants to Cook, a trash compact that falls in love with a robot, or an old man that floats away with a Cub Scout. And you know that we're never going to sell, no matter how successful, we're never going to sell a lot of toy walkers. So basically we try to span that range and not peg it. You say everything's got to be commercial or successful. I think you lose artistic integrity. If you go the other way, you become sort of art house. So we say, well, let's trust ourselves as filmmakers.
I think, if Andrew Stan were here, you would say, well, we try to make films for ourselves. And by that he doesn't mean I'm trying to make, I'm not being Truffaut or Godard or something like that. It's like, I'm kind of an average film girl when you get down to it, and I'm a family guy, and I have a couple kids and a wife, and I'm sort of a regular guy in a lot of ways, and I want to make a film that I want to see and I can take my family to as well. So it's not as selfish or self-absorbed as it sounds. At the heart of it is, we let the filmmakers trust their instincts and the instincts of the brain trust, rather than trust research data about what's going to work or whether it's going to work as a 4-quadrant film or whatever, because we all know that's such bullshit. I mean, it doesn't actually make something, all it tells you is something that people have liked before. It doesn't tell you what they're gonna like prospectively, and I think it's a good thing. That said, we'll do at least an audience preview typically, and if we find something where people are just confused about something we had no intention of confusing, or if there's something that's distracting or upsetting or something that we just didn't see, we're not immune to wanting to, adjust those things, but it's not about adjusting the stall for